Good afternoon, Professor Peter Williamson, Venezuela Ambassador, His Excellency Alfredo Toro Hardy, President of SMU, Professor Arnold Di Meyer, Provost and Deputy President of SMU, Professor Rajendra Srivastava, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Singapore Management University Shaw Foundation Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Peter Williamson, Honorary Professor of International Management at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, Fellow Commoner and Director of Studies in Management at Jesus College, Cambridge, to present a lecture on accelerated innovation, responding to the next China challenge. Before we begin, I would like to invite SMU's Provost to say a few words. Professor Srivastava, please.
Your Excellency, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, members of the community, good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Peter Williamson to deliver his lecture on accelerated innovation, responding to the next China challenge, as the 2013 Shaw Foundation Distinguished Faculty Lecturer. The lecture series was established with a generous gift from the Shaw Foundation in 2001. And it sets out to promote a deeper understanding of the issues arising from a rapidly changing global environment, and to inspire the community to learn from people whose work and whose lives have had a profound impact on the world around us. Professor Williamson is indeed such a person. He has been visiting and studying business in China for some 30 years. It's not a new fascination. He has assisted numerous multinationals and more recently, Chinese companies venturing abroad. He has published several books and papers and has shared his inside knowledge of China's developing business strategies and models. Professor Williamson's academic career is indeed distinctive. He has held professorships at London Business School, Harvard Business School, and INSEAD in Singapore. He is formerly with Merrill Lynch and the Boston Consulting Group, and he earned his PhD in business economics from Harvard University. Perhaps I should call him a pracademic. He is an honorary professor of international management at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School and fellow commoner and director of studies in management at Jesus College, Cambridge. Many of you may have read his 2000 book titled Dragons at Your Door, How Chinese Cost Innovation is Disrupting the Rules of Global Competition, which he co-authored with Ming Cheng. In this regard, in this book, he argued that the new competitive challenge from Chinese businesses was like nothing seen by Western companies, since the Japanese had challenged the Western companies in the automotive and consumer electronics market. By strategically implementing cost innovation or processes to relentlessly reduce costs while enhancing value, Chinese firms were advancing into high-end products and industries and competing on such high-value activities as engineering, design, and R&D. Western managers should therefore forget the stereotype of Chinese companies as producers of cheap, low-quality imitations. Now, 6 years later, Professor Williamson argues that accelerated innovation is the new frontier of global competition. The focus of Chinese companies is on re-engineering and industrializing R&D and innovation to make it faster and cheaper. It is time for other companies, large and small, to rethink their own approaches to innovation as a result. This is of particular relevance to SMU, where we have identified innovation and entrepreneurship as one of our 3 key areas of excellence. These are areas where we are investing in thought leadership and research, where we are building a recognized array of academic programs, and where we have the expertise to influence and practice and to work with industry. Many of you will also recall the lecture delivered here in March by Professor Zhang Xi, president of Shanghai Jiaotong University, Professor Zhang spoke on the surging Chinese economy and outlined the massive tenfold increase in R&D spending in Chinese universities. Today, Professor Williamson will provide examples of how Chinese companies are speeding up the classic innovation cycle and the mindset that drives this approach. He will then examine some of the implications of this for global competition and how foreign companies and foreign policymakers, particularly in Southeast Asia, might successfully respond to these rapid developments. These are key issues for everyone, studying innovation, teaching innovation, practicing innovation. So I know you're all looking forward to this lecture, and without much ado, I would like to invite Professor Williamson. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to give the Shaw lecture. In full disclosure, I have to tell you that I'm not here to sell you a silver bullet this afternoon, but I hope I can try to give you some food for thought about what's happening in China and the way it will change all our lives. I'd like to organize my remarks this afternoon around a three-part narrative. You always have to have a narrative these days. A story is not good enough. So it's a three-part narrative. And the first part is concerning the largely unseen rise of Chinese innovation capabilities. And I want to make that point because I think a lot has been happening in China in innovation that we don't see or don't really fully appreciate. And why do I think that's important? Well, it was summed up in a conversation I had with a pop star. I don't speak to many pop stars in my line of business, but I did speak to one, and his name is Sting. And he said to me, "It took me 10 years to become an overnight success." And I think that has an important lesson for what's happening in China, that a lot of people say, well, how is China possibly, now it's begun to focus on innovation, able to do this quickly, to learn this so quickly? But I would argue, and the first part of my lecture argues, that actually over 30 years, a lot has been happening to build capabilities in China, not only perhaps over 30 years, maybe over 2,000 years, but I think it's important to realize that we're not starting from zero in this process. The second thing, which is probably the core of what I hope is somewhat new in my address today, is talking about accelerated innovation. I think the Chinese are actually rethinking the processes we use for R&D and innovation to see how to speed them up, and equally to see how to fit them to the strengths of a Chinese and Asian environment that might be different from what you find in other parts of the world. And the provost gave me quite a hard task in terms of the implications for this, but I would like to say a few words toward the end about how we should respond to this, both as business and policy makers. So let me start out with the first topic, which is this unseen rise of Chinese innovation. And coming from Cambridge, of course, I have to remind you of Joseph Needham, who was one of the first Westerners really to systematically study innovation in China over a long period. And he published a book in 1954 entitled Science and Civilization in China. Now, of course, one of the points he made in this book that was China has been a world leader in science and technology for much of human history. And of course, we're all aware of the four greats that we often talk about: gunpowder, the compass, paper, and printing. But what I think is interesting about Needham's work is that it runs to 7 volumes. So he did find rather a lot of other innovations in China than those 4 great things. Some of them came as a bit of a surprise to me. They included cast iron, the plowshare, the stirrup, And the most surprising to me, given what happened in the development after that, was the clockwork escapements that are at the core of timekeeping. And many of these, of course, we think outside Asia are Western inventions. So we begin with this long history of innovation in China across quite a broad spectrum of different forms of human endeavor. So why do we have this perception that China is only an imitator? Well, I think one reason is the very long view. And a man called Alan Kohler spent a lot of his professional life trying to figure out shares of world GDP since, as you see in this chart, the year 1 AD. So he's gone back a long way. But if you look at the blue line, which is China, I'm not sure why he chose blue rather than red, but anyway, he's chosen blue. You see that basically China missed the Industrial Revolution. You see that peak there up until around 1820, and then we missed the Industrial Revolution, and China's share of the world GDP fell dramatically over the 19th century, right up, of course, until things began to open up in 1978. So we have, because of this history, a perception that China is not on the technological frontier, it's not so innovative. And that's quite understandable, but we shouldn't forget that, as the Chinese often say to me, the last 200 years is only a temporary cycle. The second reason why I think we don't recognize some of the innovation that's been happening in China is because of two popular myths about innovation. And the first of those myths, which I'm going to expand upon in a moment, is the idea that innovation must equal new technology, extended functionality, and higher specification. And maybe it can be much broader than that. And the second reason, which I think is particularly relevant to some of the things that are being done here at SMU and to this part of the world, is the idea that the best conditions for innovation are some form of idealized version of Silicon Valley. That methodology, that approach, that environment works incredibly well for Silicon Valley. But maybe it doesn't work terribly well for China or other places. And yet, a lot of times what we see is that people say, if you want innovation, you need to create this mythical beast that exists in Silicon Valley. So I think that also clouds our judgment about what innovation has been happening in China. And it raises the question which I'd like you to think about as I go through, what kind of model of innovation makes sense for Asia? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of models that the Chinese have adopted to become innovative and, as we go through, to accelerate the rate of innovation. Now, the provost mentioned that as part of this broader view of innovation that I believe has been going on building capabilities in innovation for 30 years, came cost innovation, which was what my 2007 book with Ming Zheng was about. That talked about, and I'm going to give a few examples, just in case one or two of you haven't read the book, on new technology into mass markets quickly, variety at low cost, and turning niche markets into mass markets. But I do try to keep up with the times, so I've added a few things since then, some other types of broader innovation. The first is application innovation. The second is what I call re-innovation. The third is business model innovation. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the R&D and technological innovation that you start to see happening in China. So all this is by way of context to understand as we start to move to the future, which is what I call accelerated innovation, what is the jumping off point? What is the foundation that has been laid in China for enabling them to accelerate the innovation process? So as many of you probably recall, if you have looked at the book or had the misfortune to hear me before, that one of the examples I like is digital direct X-rays, because I think it embodies the mentality difference between what a lot of Western companies, or maybe companies in Singapore, think about when they think about innovation, and the way the Chinese approach the problem. So Digital direct X-ray technology is quite amazing. Instead of those lovely pieces of plastic film that we used to have, at least if you're old as I am, you remember them as bits of plastic in a light box. People came up with the technology to digitize an X-ray signal directly into a computer system. And because this was a fantastic new technology, most of the Western companies focused on making it do something truly amazing, which was to take a video image of the beating heart. It has the other advantage that it actually requires a lot less X-ray radiation on your body, and so you can actually use it to take a video. And that's our definition of innovation. More functionality, high technology for high-tech solutions. Let's push it to the boundary of where we can go. But the Chinese took a different approach. They said, well, actually, I think this technology can make a huge difference in ordinary types of applications like chest X-rays. And so they created a machine that instead of costing 350,000 euro, only cost 20,000 euro. And that creates an interesting situation that in the mass market, the Chinese had a much better product than the foreign competitors who were still trying to sell outdated analog technology. Now, GE and Philips have learned to rise to this challenge, to serve this mid-market that was created by Chinese innovation. But for me, the innovation was to understand that a new technology could revolutionize a mass market, not only a top-end market, a niche market. And interestingly, to respond to that challenge, GE and Philips had to use their Chinese subsidiaries because the mentality in their home bases was not really suitable to this kind of innovation. So that's the first sort of innovation that we see. And again, the reason I'm talking about this before I come on to the acceleration of innovation is to understand the foundational thinking that is behind what is now taking place. The second example is customization at low cost. So this is innovation which re-engineers product development and production processes to deliver more customization without what, if you come from my country, you might call a Savile Row price tag. So it doesn't come at the kind of huge premium that you require if you go to buy a suit in Savile Row. And a good example of that is Haier. I put here a few examples: detergent-free washing machines to save water in Australia, washing machines capable of handling Muslim robes, portable washing machines for Japanese and US students, freezers capable of remaining cold during hours of power shortages in Africa, or 3-door refrigerators for the increasing number of Europeans who are elderly and infirm. But the point is that they have actually enabled customization and choice in the mass market, and that's, and again, an innovation. It's not something totally new, it's adjustments of the current product, but it's actually started to build in these companies skills of finding new applications, thinking how do I creatively find solutions to them, and how do I re-engineer the production process and the whole supply chain in order to serve them. So there are some examples of what we talked about in 2007 as cost innovation, building the base of innovation in China. Chinese went on to do new things. Another high technology is nano needles. So this company used these nano needles as a drug delivery service. They're actually smaller than a human hair, and they deliver pharmaceuticals by perforating the skin, but they're so short that they don't hurt because they don't hit the nerve endings in the blood vessels. But my reason for telling you about this is, again, we think nano needles, that has to be for something like diabetes, and of course they did use it for diabetes. But the biggest market they used it for was actually acne, a very simple problem that's quite widespread. But again, the thinking of saying, not everything about innovation is coming up with something new. Quite a lot of innovation is taking a technology and finding new applications for it, especially in areas which are considered simple. So, or maybe one of the barriers a lot of times in innovation is to say, acne is a simple, common problem, therefore we don't use nanoneedles to solve it. But actually the Chinese do say that, so they have a different mentality about how this works. One of my favorite other types of innovation that I see building the capabilities for innovation in China is what I like to call re-innovation. That's taking an existing technology that's considered mature and help it to be reborn. And an example of that is something called absorption air conditioning, which was invented by a Frenchman in the 19th century. Basically, you heat up a salt of sodium bromide and you use an osmotic process to power a heat exchanger. And that process or that technology was applied for many, many years in refrigerators for caravans. So we hadn't forgotten about this technology, but we used it only in a very specific context. And the reason it's useful for caravans is because electrical refrigerators would drain the battery very quickly, and obviously you can't have an electric cable connected to your caravan when you're driving it along the road, but it does have a gas cylinder, and therefore a technology that goes from heat to cold in one step turns out to be very useful for caravans. So we were very happily using it for caravans, but a Chinese company called Yuanda or Broad came along and thought, well, actually, electrical chillers are not very efficient because they require 5 energy transformations in order to move from heat to cold. So you have to put fuel into a power plant, which creates thermal energy, and that goes into a turbine, which creates mechanical energy. That's then converted to electrical energy, which you then reconvert to mechanical energy in a compressor in the refrigerator, which produces cold. So the engineers among you will all know that every time you make an energy transformation, you lose yield. And so it's a very inefficient process to be doing this. So they said, well, we've got a technology that moves from heat to cold in one step, so it should be much more efficient. In fact, in many cities of the world, there's a lot of waste heat around, so I could use that waste heat to produce air conditioning. But we only put this technology in caravans. So they said, well, perhaps we need to make it bigger. So this is a picture here of Madrid Airport. And the air conditioning system in Madrid Airport is powered by this company's product using absorption air conditioning systems. As you see here, they've made it rather bigger. That's one of the modules of this thing than we see in a caravan. So a lot of people say to me, well, you know, they didn't invent anything. It's true they didn't invent anything, but they built capabilities that actually are very useful in innovation in the sense of taking a technology, one that had been parked in a corner, if you like, in caravans, and, excuse the pun, and actually spreading it into a new application. And it turned out to be very useful because in an energy-constrained society, the ability to use waste heat or increasingly cheap natural gas turned out to be a very good technology. And they also developed the technology by completing a lot of generations of improvement in a period of time, which allowed them to optimize the system to make it about 60% more efficient than existing air conditioning systems. And interesting, they are able to perfect that system so well that they sell it as a premium over Japanese competitors. So all the components actually come from Japan or from Denmark or from Germany, but they're put together in a way that they have learned by actually going through cycles very quickly. And I'm going to come back to that because that cycling through and driving down the learning curve is very important for accelerating the process of innovation. Now, the person that owns this company, Mr. Jiang Yu, is a slightly crazy individual. Some of you have probably seen that he is trying to build the tallest building in the world in Changsha using prefabricated modules. Whether or not this will work, I don't know. But he's always thinking, how can I use existing technologies in new ways? How can I take technologies we've parked in the corner and reinvigorate them by actually scaling them up or changing them? And again, that kind of process means that lots of companies of China have, over the last 30 years, developed a lot of the capabilities that you need for innovation. Because one of the things I mentioned that's a problem in the Silicon Valley model is that we spend a lot of attention on the first stage of the process, coming up with the idea. But every one of you who's in business knows that the money from innovation comes from actually commercializing the innovation. And so the fact that the Chinese have learned a lot about those processes further down the stage of commercialization and innovation is actually very powerful for them. And it provides an interesting base to move forward. The next kind of innovation that we see very common both in China and I should say in India, probably even more so, is innovating the business model. So we don't change the technology at all, we just change the business model. And a good example of that is in these port cranes. And the standard practice is to provide service remotely and to only install new equipment or upgrades in scheduled visits. And that's extremely problematic for the customers because in all port applications, utilization is absolutely critical. So you don't want to wait if it breaks down, and you want the installation of upgrades to happen immediately. So they simply changed the business model and made a permanent service capability on the client site. Now, they have a company in Finland who are their partners, and this company in Finland is a very good company, but it said that this business model was ruinously expensive because they said you need to train 10 specialists and keep them on the site, which you can't possibly afford to do. So the Chinese said, why don't we just train one person to solve 80% of the problems, and only 20% of the time will we send a specialist out. So we can afford to keep one person there perfectly well. And so what we've done is we've provided faster service and lower cost simply by changing the business model. So again, it's not an innovation in technology, but it's an innovation in the way we do the business model. Now, my reason for going through those things was to emphasize that when we talk about China accelerating innovation, when we talk about China moving to do technological, more traditional innovation, they're not starting from zero. They're starting from a platform that a lot of these stages of the innovation cycle have been perfected there for 30 years. It's just that they don't necessarily do the breakthrough front end, but they do all the rest of it. And so now they're thinking, well, perhaps we could do the breakthrough front end. There's a lot of debates with an expert in the front row, David Llewellyn, here on the IP about how good these patents are and so forth. What you see in this chart is that historically, the multinationals, the green line, were granted many more patents in China than Chinese companies, which is the red line. But you see something interesting happening from 2004. There's an almost exponential increase in Chinese patent applications. And the foreign applications have also been increasing, but not as fast. So yes, the Chinese are starting to push into technological innovation. I'm not expecting the whole innovation system to go there tomorrow or huge breakthroughs, but we're starting to say we need to push in that direction. And again, we're moving from quite a strong base in the rest of the chain. But even in traditional technological innovations like this, the Chinese always bring a twist to the way they do things. And here's a picture of the fastest computer in the world. you might be surprised to know that that computer sits in China's National Defense University, became the fastest computer when it was launched in June 2013. But what's interesting about that world's fastest computer is that it's not created by having a small team of engineers creating amazing super fast chips. All they did was take widely available Intel chips and wrote a routine to make them work together better. That's where their fast computer came from. So again, even in traditional technological innovation, the Chinese approach, because of history, because of resources, because of experience, often takes a different approach from what we see in the Western markets. So my point of the first part of the narrative is this. China has been developing non-traditional innovation capabilities for somewhere between 30 and 2,000 years, while most of us weren't looking. And we didn't see them because they weren't breakthroughs, they didn't follow the traditional path, but we shouldn't underestimate the capabilities that have been built in China. So that's a story of the foundation and the past. Let me turn now to the future. And a point I'd like to make, and you can perhaps challenge this in the question and answer, but is I believe China going forward will change innovation just as much as innovation changes China. And why do I say that? Because although China has many weaknesses when it comes to innovation, are far from effective in enforcing IP protection, immature domestic innovation ecosystem. When we've studied the ecosystem in China, there's lots of holes in the network. It's not well connected together. There's a lot of provincial competition and so on. Certainly limited linkages to international networks, and something that I think is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, which it's interesting to watch how the new leadership in China is dealing with, is excessive resources captive inside big monopoly SOEs who are not really delivering for the productivity in the country. And they are a very important vested interest. So there are lots of problems. So why do I think that despite all these problems, China will change innovation as much as innovation changes China? Well, because as I've said, they now have a strong experience base for innovation. And secondly, because they're starting to redefine the way innovation is done. And that's where I want to go next in terms of thinking of the second part of the narrative, which is the idea of accelerated innovation or the next frontier. Having studied, and I spend a lot of time with my colleagues in Chinese companies, I see 4 ways that they're accelerating innovation by redefining the way it's done. The first of those is by industrializing the innovation process. So I'm going to give some examples of that in a minute, but we often have this idea that innovation has to be a small group of highly creative people sipping coffee or tea or something in a beautiful environment, and they come up with this wonderful innovation. Well, that is certainly one way to do it, but there's a lot of sorts of innovation that might be useful to be industrialized. It might be more efficient to industrialize it, and if you're sitting in China with the numbers of people you have, the kinds of people you have, the culture you have, actually industrializing it might make a lot of sense. And I'm going to show you some examples of where industrializing the innovation process not only makes it cheaper, it makes it enormously faster. It's not applicable to all sorts of innovation, but there's quite a big category of innovation that it's applicable to. The second thing I'm going to talk about in accelerating innovation is pushing the boundaries of simultaneous engineering. Again, there's nothing new about simultaneous engineering. It's been talked about in the innovation literature for 50 or 100 years, but they are pushing it to new levels. The third is something I mentioned earlier, which is cycling rapidly through launch, test, improve. So putting things out into the market, testing them, and improving. And the final thing, which I think is very fascinating, is building organizations which combine vertical hierarchy with horizontal flexibility. And that's something that actually, in most Western eyes, or the eyes of Western managers I deal with, they would say is a contradiction in terms, that you can't have those things together because if you have a vertical hierarchy, it's a bureaucracy, and therefore it can't have horizontal flexibility. Well, I will show you some examples where that has been broken down. So let me go on in the second part of the lecture to talk a little bit about those 4 types of acceleration innovation and give you some examples. So generally what I've observed these companies doing when they try to industrialize the innovation process is they divide the R&D and innovation process into a multitude of small steps. So they look, instead of saying, we put these smart people together in a room and it's a black box, they say, can we tease out what actually is happening here? And can we actually map it out and divide it into a whole lot of steps? And then we'll put lots of people on each step, because if we put lots of people on each step, we'll be able to go a lot faster. So they say, well, if we can design R&D and innovation as an industrialized process, we don't need to hire PhDs. You know, we can hire thousands of R&D workers, most of whom are trade school graduates rather than masters or PhDs. So they might need a few PhDs to have the initial idea, but from then on, the process is actually done by a lot of people who are industrial workers, except they're working in an R&D context. And they tend to remove the bottlenecks created by expensive, scarce equipment by substituting flexible labor. So an example of that is a company in the pharmaceutical industry called Wuxi Aptec. And it works on projects such as hepatitis C. And what I observed is that by industrializing the process and using massive numbers of people, they can complete the development and testing of these drugs in half or even a quarter of the time that's common in the US. So they're using this industrialization not only to cut costs, but to dramatically increase the speed at which they can do these things. Now, as I say, you can't do it for all sorts of innovations. It needs to be where the process is subject to analysis and decomposition. So it doesn't work for everything. But I think often we have this idea that more R&D and innovation processes have to be magic, black box magic than the reality is. If we really sat down and asked ourselves what is happening in this process, we might find that 80% of them were industrializable and 20% weren't. I don't know, but we come to this with a particular prejudice. And of course, the people that are paid a lot of money to be creative boffins are not going to tell you that actually it's a process that can be industrialized, because then they'll have to compete with trade school graduates. So that's the first thing I see happening. The second thing I see happening is pushing the boundaries of simultaneous engineering in R&D and innovation. Now, in most organizations outside China I look into, we have this idea that R&D is a linear process. A very famous model in innovation is the waterfall model, where it's a series of sequential steps, and you have to finish one step before you go on to the next step. And again, there's an obvious risk in trying to circumvent that process and do things simultaneously, which we've learned. The obvious risk is that the information necessary to take the next step is not available or incomplete until you finalize the step before. So it's a perfectly logical idea that we should go in sequence. But it also slows down the process dramatically. So again, because things are moving so quickly in China, because things are so fluid in the market, and because, therefore, speed is so important, people have said, can I push the boundaries of simultaneous engineering into new areas? And there are many things that are actually we find are subject to simultaneous engineering. And a good example of that is the PC business. So I've put Lenovo here on the chart. If you look at the rate at which they come up with new tablets and new phones and new computers, it's truly amazing, actually, very, very short time period. And I'm actually going to show you some statistics on that. Now, the reason they can do that is because each time they make one of these things, they're not inventing an entirely new product. I mean, most of the components and interface are fairly standardized, whether it's a tablet or a PC or a phone or whatever it is. You know, it's not a completely new technology. And so they say, we actually don't need to wait till the R&D people have finished in this component before we start designing how the thing looks and fits together. We can do it in parallel. An interesting experiment that occurred there, of course, is when Lenovo took over IBM's PC business. And what they've been able to do by pushing the boundaries of simultaneous engineering is to reduce a 12 to 18-month product development cycle they inherited from IBM down to 6 to 8 months. So they just do more things in parallel. So again, if you're in that kind of market, and I'll say something more about this later, speed incredibly important. So that kind of reduction from 12 to 18 months to 6 to 8 months makes a huge impact on your competitiveness in the market. Now, that's not only applied to things like PCs. So one of my favorite examples in the 2007 book was pianos. There's a nice German grand piano there. Sorry, I made a spelling mistake in the title at the top, but you see the correct spelling there. Käseberg piano. Lovely German piano made by Pearl River Piano of Guangdong, which is the largest maker of pianos in the world with 25% global market share. But what I found interesting, having gone to visit them, is that they put together a team of 6 designers, 10 secondees drawn from all sorts of areas, from procurement through to sales, 2 testers, 3 computer engineers, and 40 prototyping craftspeople. So it's a big team, and it includes everybody that's involved in the chain of thinking of a product right through to getting it to market. And they put them all in a single team, and they got them all to work together simultaneously. And in the process of that, they managed to come up with a piano series where the traditional sequential development techniques would take years to complete a similar set of design, and almost 10 times the cost. So their cost is 1/10, and they can do it in 5 months, as I put on the top, instead of years in this process, simply by saying we're just going to put everybody that's involved in idea through to final market and installation servicing together in one team and get them to work together to speed things up. So that's the second thing I see starting to happen in China. The third is the use of launch, test, improve approach to innovation. So we're pretty used to this. Every time you curse and swear at a Microsoft beta version of software, you know about launch, test, improve, which is basically I take something that's new, doesn't really work, but I put it into the market, and the customer tells me how, through pain, how I need to fix it. Right? So, we don't accept that for most products, but actually in China it's much more acceptable than it is in most other markets, because it's a very fluid market, it's a very fast-moving market, there's not so many regulations, and the brands are not so strongly embedded, so people worry less about actually damaging the brand by going through this process of launching stuff into the market before it's absolutely ready. Now, in the press recently, you've probably seen a lot of this company, Xiaomi, small in Chinese, and because it's really come from nowhere to be a very significant player in the mobile phone and tablet business. And basically, it releases a new version of its software every week in response to customer suggestions. So they just taking on board what the customer says, feed it into the product, and release it again. And they also often ask users to vote on features using Weibo for which things should be included. So they're basically, we sometimes talk about co-innovation with the customer. Well, they've taken it to a whole new level, right? Very, very fast sort of feedback. Now, I don't say that's the only way to do things, but if you compare it with Apple, who I would describe as having a release cycle which is embodied in we design the best and then stick to it. It goes 1 year, 2 years before they really come up with something new. Well, if you do that, you have to put out something in the market that's an absolutely mind-boggling, that really blows the thing away. So there are different ways to do innovation, but again, because of the emphasis on speed and the fluidity and flexibility of the market, the Chinese have pushed this launch, test, improve approach to speeding up innovation to whole new levels. And it's not only in products. You see it in various other businesses, like Tencent's messaging, instant messaging product, QQ, which is probably the world's largest in that area. And they, I just took one example, they put an instant messaging reminder service for birthdays. As you all know, if you forget your partner's birthday, it's not very good usually. So these reminders were quite useful. But within weeks, lots of people said, well, I want to have a reminder to make sure I don't miss the sports game, and I've got a tennis match, and even online gamers had future games. So they just added all this stuff from feedback immediately. And now they've made that into a routine. Basically what they do is they routinely launch basic platforms, and then they add functionality based on what the user says they want. So instead of doing market research and then going away and trying to produce the thing, they just see what does the user say they need, and we've got a big team of people that can do it quickly. Now they're unfortunately in a product that you can change fairly quickly because of the nature of it, but you also see it in other products. This company, Mindray, is another product in medical equipment, and it launched a new electrocardiograph after 18 months of development. And then they went to watch the use of this thing in hospitals. And I think this is an important point, because sometimes when companies try to use launch, test, improve, they ask the customer. But maybe the customer can't really tell you, right? They can't really conceive of how all this is working. They don't even know really what they want, especially in these new technologies. So they just watched. They go out and watch what people do, or where they get frustrated because the product doesn't do it. And they added new functions to this electrocardiograph, like blood oxygen level testing and continuous monitoring, in just a few months. Because they've got the basic product, they take another component technology that's already developed, they say we'll add it to this thing, and therefore we can speed up the whole process of responding to the customer. So rather than trying to get the thing perfect and then throwing it out in the market and hoping that it's going to be a blockbuster, they put out something that's sort of half-finished as a platform, and then they just let the customer tell them what they need to add to it. And they built a very responsive system for embodying those changing customer needs. The final one I wanted to mention is the creation of organizations. And this focus from vertical hierarchy combined with horizontal flexibility. And this this particularly struck me when I went to spend some time with Huawei, who have bought a number of technology companies in Europe, and I've been working with them on this issue. And they gave me their name cards. And the name cards said their expertise, but it didn't say a department. It didn't. I said, why does it not tell me what department you're in? And they said, well, because no one's really in a department. Everybody is part of a project team that, we know this in a consulting firm or a law firm or an investment bank, we do this. We bring together people and they work on a project, and then when they're finished, they go and work on another project. But we don't usually do this in the manufacturing sector especially. So what they had done, and I see in many, many Chinese companies, is they create enormous vertical hierarchy with horizontal authoritarian top-down goal setting with rewards and punishments. And we generally associate that with an inflexible bureaucracy. It does have certain problems because if the person at the top is wrong, nobody questions them. They simply just execute on what they're told to do. But it also makes the goal very clear and puts enormous pressure on the organization to deliver quickly. So if you're a person that can't tell the boss you haven't done it on time, what you tend to do is you find anybody in the company that can help you. So it has enormous horizontal flexibility. And by combining those things, we're able to speed up the process of which innovation happens. So there's also an organizational approach to accelerating innovation. Let me expand on that idea a little bit more. In many companies, certainly in the West, and I've no doubt some pressure has been on Singaporean companies to do the same thing, we have created flat organizations. Because we said those flat organizations would be more responsive to the market and more flexible. But the problem with flat organizations, as I've tried to demonstrate in that diagram, is they require enormous discussion and consensus in order to get anything done, because you need to talk to everybody else who has an opinion on what you're doing. So yes, they have many advantages, but they do often tend to slow us down because you've got a bigger organization to bring with you on board with any new initiative. So by having this strong hierarchical organization, but this flexible horizontal organization based largely around teams, it's not good at questioning whether we're going in the right direction, but it is good at moving very quickly when the direction is set. And so we can probably accept that not every innovation direction is going to work, but if we do them fast enough, we'll find out very quickly if this is going to be successful. Now, what I've described is a set of processes, a set of process innovations that has actually rethought what does R&D and innovation look like from the ground up, and tried to say, how can we change it, whether by industrializing it, pushing simultaneous engineering, launch, test, improve, moving to a different organization structure. I'm not saying that it works for every type of innovation. I'm not saying it works for every industry. But if they succeed in doing this, they're going to set new standards for how quickly innovation processes work. And when we look in most technologies and most companies, it really is shocking how long it takes a new idea to get into the mainstream mass market. You're often talking about 5 or 10 years or even more for this to happen. So they are challenging that and saying, we can actually make that move faster. Now, a great weakness is how can I feed that innovation capability with new ideas? And I think it's fair to say, and most Chinese companies would agree with me, that there's a limitation on how well we can ramp up the completely new ideas and creativity side of what we do. There are people, there's returnees that are coming that are bringing this. So what I see is the problem of how to feed this accelerated innovation capability that I've built. And one way to do it is exemplified by a company here in Singapore, a company called AAC Technologies. It makes microphones and cameras for mobile phones. It supplies Apple and Samsung. And you see what this company did is it started in 1993 making buzzers for alarm clocks. And basically, over time, it's developed many of the things that I've explained in terms of accelerating the innovation around new electromechanical components. But it didn't have some of the basic things that you need to feed this engine of accelerated innovation. So it said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy them. So I'm going to buy a set of technology companies around the world. If I take the one at the top there, this Danish company, it has a technology for stabilizing the lenses in the mobile phone. So if you've got a sophisticated camera in your mobile phone, it's got somewhere between 4 and 6 lenses stacked up in a tube behind that little thing that you see in your phone. And most of those lenses are made of a sort of plastic, and when they put them through the oven to seal the components in the phone at 200 degrees Celsius, they distort. So this company has a technology for making a glass plastic hybrid to stop that happening, right? So it's only a small company. It has about 20 or 30 employees in Denmark, but they bought it because they need it to feed this engine that can take that idea and rapidly put it to market. This another company over here, ID8 Mobile, they're a company in Boston. And they built their company basically by designing things like headsets for mobile phones and so on. Now again, the Chinese company didn't have this design capability. So it decided, let's buy this company and we can actually feed it into this rapid innovation process as well. So that's what they've done. They've set up a research center here in Singapore to work on aerials, which is an area where many of you probably recognize and suffer that the aerial in your phone is not as good in terms of the reception as it needs to be these days. So if you put that together, a capability to accelerate innovation and the ability to buy companies, which I don't say is easy, but I might just mention one thing about this. We know acquisitions are always difficult to make work. All the academic research says that if you've got a 50% chance, you're doing well of this thing actually coming off in terms of delivering what you thought when you bought it. But if you buy a company with a small group of engineers who are generally short of money and can't get their product to market quickly to increase their cash flow, you've got a pretty good argument for why they should be acquired by you. You're going to give them more money, you're going to give them more resources, and you're going to take their product to market faster. That washes away many of the integration problems with the fact that these people perhaps think they don't want to really work for a Chinese company or so on, because it's a pretty attractive offer. So they tend to put aside those things and say, we can be part of this. So all of that comes to say that we probably need to think about how we might respond to this. Why do I think we need to respond? Well, because I think speed to market, as information moves around the world at very high speed, is becoming more and more important. Because consumers today know whether your product is leading edge, right? And that was beautifully summed up by the former CEO of Samsung Electronics, who calls it the sashimi principle. So simply, outdated products lose value fast. When I used to be in Japan, the Japanese told me, when you go to buy a sashimi, look at the darkness of the tuna. If it's too dark, don't buy it because it's oxidized, it's lost its quality. And he says, more to the extent that information moves faster in this technology global world, it's very hard to hide the fact if your product is not on the leading edge. Whether that's a service product or a physical product, the customer is going to easily compare. And even the service business, you've got a lot of comparison websites that help them do it for it, and they find out, well, actually, this is not on the leading edge. So I think it's going to be important for that reason. The second reason I think it's going to be important is that accelerated innovation often reduces costs as well as time. So it's not a trade-off that you get speed at a higher cost, which is the way we've often thought about it, because if you try to speed up a traditional innovation process, you often find the cost of it increases. But they're actually getting a double benefit in the sense of higher speed and lower cost. And the third reason is that accelerated innovation may prove one of the few effective responses to aggressive imitation. So I know there are people like Professor David Llewellyn here from SMU who's working on trying to improve the ability to fight imitators of your patents and IP, but even despite his many talents, he's not 100% successful. So I think this is a reality of life. Again, as information and knowledge moves more quickly around the world, imitation is becoming a bigger problem. By the way, I was, just a slight aside on this, I was in China just on the way here. And a lot of people told me, you see, they said, Professor Williamson, you misinterpret imitation. We're not copying what we see. We're seeing the idea, and we're using this accelerated innovation process to create an alternative. Right? So we're doing parallel imitation. That's a different kind of... We didn't think of the idea. You thought of the idea. Very nice. It's just that we can bring it to market faster than you can. What's also shocking, in the Shanzai, the copy mobile phone business in China, some of the imitators actually bring the product out before the people that invented them. So this is there. So I think it's for those three reasons this speed is becoming more important. So we have to think about how to respond to it. I think that raises three questions for all of us, and I'm going to pose them as questions because I can't say to you that I fully know the answers. And the first question that I think what I've said poses to us is it time to fundamentally re-engineer our existing innovation processes? Not for everything we do, but for some of the things we do. And I think the president of SMU will like this next example because it's a Belgian company. A Belgian company that makes everything from electromagnetic shielding to champagne corks. That's quite a range, called Beckhardt. And I just picked up a quote talking to this chief technology officer. He said, we had to re-engineer the whole R&D process to respond to the China challenge, as well as undertaking R&D in China, the first place in the world where they did it. It caused us to rethink the process we have. And as I say, I'm not saying that we need to rethink every process everywhere for every type of innovation, but there's quite a big sort of innovation that maybe with this China challenge we need to rethink our process. And I think also that has a particularly interesting implication for Singapore, and here I'm possibly going to get deported before I leave early in the morning tomorrow. But I sometimes think there's a tendency to take established processes like Silicon Valley and say, can we recreate them in Singapore? Because that works. And I think everything I've said says that Singapore, as it puts more emphasis on innovation, needs to think what is the innovation process that suits me, my people, the kind of industries I'm working in, and the kind of environment I have. And the answer might be Silicon Valley, but the answer might equally be some of these thoughts about more Chinese-style, accelerated, more industrialized approach to innovation. So I think there's an important question and lesson there that we might need to rethink our existing innovation processes. The second thing I think it causes us to do is to rethink, can we utilize capabilities that we have in China from our subsidiaries? So if we want to know about accelerated innovation, can we use our Chinese subsidiary to teach us this? Some other subsidiaries might teach us something else, but they might be able to teach us accelerated innovation. And I think that has some quite important implications for the structure of companies, because historically multinationals have basically done innovation at home and pushed that out or projected it out to the rest of the world. And now what we're saying is that for certain aspects of innovation, for certain activities, the subsidiary has to teach the parent. That's a reversal of roles, which in many ways for many companies is problematic. And I think it also, and this is not only true of China, it's true of many subsidiaries around the world, I think it also tends to ask us, do we need to redefine the role of the country manager? Many multinationals degraded the role of the country manager. The dominant people in the multinational company were the global business heads, people that looked after a line of business across the world. They worried about the product development, the efficient delivery of that line of business. Maybe if we're going to make more use of our subsidiaries in different countries, the country manager has to have more power, more capabilities, a more important role. And finally, maybe the next generation of Chinese global alliances should focus on using the alliance to accelerate innovation. I have a lot of debates in the UK with policymakers about this to say, how can we collaborate with the Chinese on innovation? And I say, you're working in the wrong stage of the chain. You should be cooperating with the Chinese on accelerating an idea to market, a new technology to get to the cost level and price level that you need to put in the mass market. And therefore, you start to see this happening, that, you know, a good example is the pharmaceutical industry, which has huge problems with its R&D pipeline because the pipeline is just not good enough to maintain their levels of sales and profitability given generics and other things that are coming along. And maybe they, as AstraZeneca has done, have to start to think, can I use some of these Chinese capabilities to accelerate the process by which I get from a new compound to actually something that's out in the market? So let me leave you with just some closing thoughts. I believe there's one inescapable conclusion from what I've said, and that is China will increasingly challenge us to rethink the way we innovate. It's not all Chinese companies. It's probably not most Chinese companies. When we wrote the book in 2007, many of my academic colleagues asked us the question, why did you concentrate on the outliers? Why did you concentrate on the tail of the distribution? Most Chinese companies are not like that. And I said to them, because you don't have to worry about most Chinese companies, you have to worry about the leading edge Chinese companies, because they are the people who are going to reshape the global competitive environment. So I make no apology for that. I'm not saying all Chinese companies are like that. I'm saying the important ones are like that because they are the ones that are going to influence the global market. So I think long seen as technological imitators, Chinese companies are now turning their attention to compete on innovation. That's very clear. They've gone as far as they can go on pure low cost. And I think also the provost mentioned the 2007 book, they're probably gone almost as far as they can go on cost innovation. It's running out of road, so they need to think of something else. But we shouldn't fool ourselves to think that they haven't been building capabilities for non-traditional innovation over 30 years, so don't believe that they start this process from ground zero. And now I believe there's a huge focus on China in making innovation dramatically faster as well as cheaper by the things I've mentioned, industrializing innovation, pushing the boundaries of simultaneous engineering, leveraging these launch, test, improve cycles, and combining the focus of hierarchy with cross-functional flexibility inside their organizations. Interestingly, I don't believe they are doing this primarily for the export or international market. I believe they're doing it because they need to do it to compete in China. And we often forget that actually, just like America, Chinese companies are driven first and foremost by the domestic market. It's not true if you're a processor in the Pearl River Delta, but for most significant companies in China, the thing that drives their strategy is the Chinese market. And the Chinese market demands exceptional speed in most of what it does, and therefore it's no surprise that they're focusing on trying to accelerate the process of innovation, because they need to find a way to differentiate themselves from other Chinese competitors as fast as possible. A final thought is, as I've suggested to you, I believe accelerated innovation is already reshaping global competition. I believe it will do more so in the future, and therefore it demands a response. And in the vein of acceleration, I would put it to you that in making that response, there is no time to lose. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for the thought-provoking lecture. May I invite you to stay on stage as we open the floor for questions?
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for the very insightful talk. I'm a PhD student at INSEAD, and I'm interested in innovation and R&D in emerging markets. So you mentioned 4 points about this accelerated innovation in China, and I think the first point was very interesting to me. So you mentioned that so the R&D process is divided into multitudes of processes, so more inventors would work in more steps. So and I thought there might be a trade-off to this in a sense that so later on, after the R&D is done, then there might be integration process because there has been so many people working on this. So given that this sort of R&D was successful, I wonder how the integration process works in order to make this happen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. A very good question. I think this is a very important insight, that to accelerate the innovation process, we often think that you just need to push it harder. But the essence of this is that you have to carefully redesign the process in order to deal with the problem that you mentioned. And it may well be, as I mentioned with the acquisitions, that the first stage upstream part of the process that requires invention, as you put it, is not subject to this industrialization. So we still have to wait till someone comes up with the idea. But the rest of it may be. And we can try to overcome, and this is what I've seen, to the problem that you mentioned, by very carefully redesigning that process to think about how can I reduce that problem. You can't eliminate it altogether, but you're going to redesign the process to reduce that issue. And therefore, I think it's important to get away from this idea that we accelerate innovation simply by trying to speed up existing processes and force them to go through faster. We need to rethink how we do it. Why does the process look like that? How can we redesign the process to have more people involved at earlier stages in the process? And I think, you know, in terms of simultaneous engineering, one of the things when you really think about it, it's amazing how little we do really involve everybody in the chain at an early enough stage in most innovation processes, because we focus on getting the technology right or the product right first and then thinking about how to sell it. Now, some companies do that, but again, they've pushed it to a higher level. So I sometimes say about China, there's nothing new, it's everything you know, only more so. And this is what is a thrust in what I have said, that they're pushing the boundaries of doing those against some of the traditional concerns that you've raised. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I'm a SMU student. I just have a specific question to ask with regards to the application of launch, test, improve away from the China market.
Yes.
Can the launch, because you explained this in terms of in China, like you gave the example of Xiaomi and Tencent, but we also know that in China they have this kind of mini protectionism. The same reason why you have Baidu and you don't have Google in China, why you have Renren and no Facebook, why you have Weibo and no Twitter. If I use your model and I put it in a more competitive market, if Google were to adopt launch, test, and improve, will it lead to, will it be as successful, or would all its users turn to, let's say, Microsoft or Yahoo? That's the first question. And if a technological startup, let's say in Singapore, not in the China market, were to use a launch, test, improve on their application service, will it still be as successful as compared to like a big incumbent like Xiaomi and Tencent? These are my two questions.
Right, okay, thank you. Again, very good questions. Well, the first thing I would say is I'm not suggesting that launch, test, improve is applied to everything. So if I'm going to take a heart drug, I'd rather that they tested it before I take it. So there are certain things which I think it's not applicable to. But I think, therefore, I think outside China, we do need to think carefully about what effect is it's going to have on our brands. Can we convince the customers that they should participate in this process, that it's a positive, not a negative? We could do some things to try to make it more acceptable. So that's one strategy that we might adopt, because you're absolutely right. There are more risks in a more mature, more stable market with stronger brands. So you have to think, how can I prepare the customer base? And you might have to do it with a smaller group of customers, or try to ring fence it in some way, which you wouldn't have to do in China, given what's happening. Or you might say, and this is an argument I've made to many companies, I think it's also true for Singaporean companies, I believe the best place in the world to pilot new ideas today is China. And so you might use the China market for that purpose. Now, again, there's the problem, if you do that, you might expose your intellectual property to being stolen. But it's certainly worth thinking about. If this is such a great environment in order to accelerate things through to market, why don't I use it? And that's really what Pepsi in my quote is saying, that we should use that. I focused on China, of course. A lot of these things are true in other emerging markets, just that that's what I happen to have studied. Your second question is, I do think the strategy is applicable to startups, because we should remember that all these companies I mentioned, they were startups once. You say they've lived in a protective environment. To some extent that's true, to some extent I don't believe it's true. They're living in a very competitive environment with other Chinese competitors who have to rise through the process of coming out from the startups. And if you look at, for example, the well-documented tussle between eBay and Taobao, it wasn't protectionism that prevented eBay from succeeding in China, in my view. It's because they managed to shoot themselves in the foot many times by doing things which were not not well adapted to the China market. But I do actually think it is a chance for a startup, because if you can get to market with a good enough product that can go through launch, test, improve fast enough, that is another factor which differentiates you from the incumbent players, which might have more difficulty in following this accelerated approach.
My name is Lieven de Meester. I'm a faculty member here at SMU. You mentioned IP protection, and I was interested whether you think kind of this different framework of IP protection that you might see in China might have played a role in creating accelerated innovation.
Yes.
That's one question. And then the second question is, if that is true, is it possible that in the West that we have the wrong approach to IP protection?
Right, okay. Very good question. That's a dangerous ground, especially with David sitting here in the front row. But anyway, I think you're right. I think the rate of imitation in China has encouraged companies to look for ways to accelerate innovation, because if they have a long cycle, they find that they don't have enough time to earn money on it before the imitators come through. So I think you're right about that. In some ways, the weakness of the system has encouraged this accelerated approach. Where does that lead us in terms of the IP protection in other countries outside China? Well, it's of course a long-standing debate, as you will know from your own work better than I. How much protection should you give to the inventor, and how much should you encourage the diffusion of new technology around? And one thing I would say, at least from the evidence I've seen, is that the Chinese Intellectual Property Office tends to want to define patents protection more narrowly than elsewhere, because they are very conscious that they don't want to slow down the speed of diffusion of new ideas and technology in the country. So I think it has had an effect. And maybe this kind of accelerated innovation does require us to think, if we're working on these time scales, have we got the balance between rewarding the inventor and diffusing the technology right in this process? So I think it's a very, very insightful question. I don't know the answer, but I think it's another one to add to the list of, does this mean we need to rethink some of our implicit assumptions that we got this trade-off right?
Professor Williamson, my name is Henry Chen. I'm a PhD student here. I have a question, is that in economics, we have been trying to use this gross value added to measure the impact of innovations on national GDP development. Now, Professor Barry Eichen Green this year came out with a new research paper with ADB saying that China can overcome the middle income trap because of the innovation ability of China. Now, his reasoning is that because China is doing this from the ground up in the process engineering side and on the product innovation, which actually has more economic impact on national development. So I want to take your ideas on this. And number two is that I want to share a comment with the audience, is that in the last 35 years, China has expanded university enrollment by 30 times. So China now today has the most number of engineering graduates in the world, and also they have the most number of STEM students in the world, scattered even in Singapore, anywhere. Now, this development strategy of combining human resources with innovation is actually following the advice of Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who was the founding Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, and he served for 5 years as the advisor of the Chinese government. And he came up with this blueprint, which is in the book that's on sale in our bookstores. So actually, yeah, you can go to buy the book Walking Through on China in our bookstore. And China is actually following that blueprint. And many Chinese government officials mentioned to me they're very grateful to Dr. Goh for his insight on the emphasis on the STEM training in China. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm not sure I want to comment on the second. I think you've made an interesting point. The first, I think it's it's right. I should tell you that I was taught by Barry Eichengreen at Harvard, so I must think he's right. But when I was studying economics, but there's a lot of talk about the middle income trap in China as if it's inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable, and I think they've come to the conclusion that actually building on the capabilities that are already there in innovation is the best way to do it, and therefore that's this emphasis on process, speed, doing the innovation process in a different way. And again, I think a lot of other places, and I won't dare say Singapore fits into this category, are sort of starstruck by Nobel Prize-winning research, which is lovely. We love it at Cambridge, but we're not trying to make money. So I think we shouldn't get carried away. There's no evidence that the place with the most Nobel Prize winners actually has the highest GDP growth. So, I think they probably are on the right track to say, there is a place for that. Eventually, we do hope to do that, but it's a fairly random process. And I think there's also something else that's very interesting. Countries and governments that have placed a lot of emphasis on funding blue sky early stage research are doing a great service to global society. But because knowledge of this type, and universities are part of this process, flows very freely around the world in a group of researchers, and it should in order to push the boundaries forward, it's very hard to capture value from that as a company or a country. And so we should do it, and it's the importance of social benefit, but in terms of development of the country, that's not where I would put my resources if I was worried about the middle income track. So I think your comments are very interesting in that respect. Yes.
Raymond Kwok from LLP and VC.com. Professor, fantastic presentation, and I just came back from China. I think what I sense there is there's one more ingredient, whereby they were able to pull along different group of Chinese from different part of the country and put them in a team and cross-fertilize the ideas. So it is fantastic. But my question actually is your last bullet point.
Right.
It demands a response. Can you share with us what is your insight?
Sorry, can I share with you?
What is the insight? I mean, what is your insight that the response that we should be?
I pose the response in terms of the three questions. But behind the three questions is my view about what the response should be. So I think the first response is we have to rethink our innovation processes and say, are they fit for purpose for what we're trying to do? Are they fast enough outside China? We need to think, or have we got ourselves in a kind of straitjacket of only thinking about innovation process in a certain way, and we need to open our minds to different kind of ways of organizing innovation. So I think that's the first thing I think needs happening. And even perhaps rethinking the definition of innovation to get away from this thing. It has to be entirely new and entirely breakthrough. I think the second thing we need to do is both for companies that have subsidiaries there or for companies that might have alliances with the Chinese, is to think, how do we use this capability in China to work for our companies, not only for the Chinese companies? So how do we harness the fact that they are good at this, just as we would harness anything that emerges anywhere in the world. Different countries, because of environments, history, people come up with different specialities of things they're good at. It happens to be that this Chinese environment is very good at accelerating innovation, so we should use it for that. And that's why I often argue to companies, and I actually get them to draw out where are they using China in what stage of the innovation cycle, and they come to the conclusion that they're not using it enough in this acceleration sort of phase of commercialization, and they need to do more of that. And I think that's also the same for national policy. I think I often discuss this point with the British government, and I have trouble with it because I'm from Cambridge, and they say, well, we should be doing, work with universities and so on. And I said, well, that's nice, you know, we love to do that, but if you really want to help Britain, you should be helping British companies use China to get their product to market faster, because that's, you know, to develop it and innovate it faster, because we have a lot of good ideas in Britain, and traditionally we've sent them to the US in order to turn them into mass markets. That was the place that had the methodologies, it had the market, it had the mentality to do that. Maybe today the place we need to send them is China, because it's also at a stage in its development, and with the history I explained that it's very good at that. So they're the things I would suggest in terms of responses.
Yen Lu Chao here. I'm an ex-Apple and now a tech entrepreneur and a business angel.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
So I have a couple questions. I
Yes.
thought somebody would have asked this first question already. One is, okay, obviously the Chinese accelerated innovation method process is very well suited for incremental innovation, where they are continuously refining, improving, launching, and so on. How about disruptive innovations, where it's more of imagination and creativity, right? So incremental innovation, it's about improving on an existing product category, whereas a disruptive innovation is more about defining a new product category. So that's, do you think this method can apply? If it does, or maybe disruptive innovation is becoming less important? I don't know. Okay, that's kind of one question
Right.
that I have. The second question is, so can they come out with the next breakthrough product? You know,
Right.
like Apple came out with the next iPhone or the
Yeah.
next iPad. Second
Yes.
question is, do you think Chinese consumers are more forgiving?
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, right. So, again, good questions. Let me first tackle the question of what we mean by disruptive innovation. There's an assumption that every disruptive innovation has to be some breakthrough technology. But actually, if you look at the literature and work on disruptive innovation, you find it's not that at all. It's improvement in performance versus cost, basically, so, or value for money. So, and I think, you know, taking existing technology and applying it to new areas, helping technology that's been parked in a corner be reborn, can all be incredibly disruptive. So I think we should be careful not to equate disruption with breakthrough. Breakthrough can create disruption. It's an important source of disruption, but it's not the only source of disruption. The second thing I would say is we probably won't see the kind of breakthrough innovation coming out of China in a huge quantity. I think that's right. And that's why I'm suggesting their strategy is to say, let's buy that skill from somewhere else through an acquisition and use our technique. And that's probably all right. The other thing I should say is, you know, the companies like Apple, your former employer, have done incredibly well with breakthrough. But as you will know, it's an extremely difficult game to play, because you have to toss the coin every time and come up with heads. And they're sitting there at the moment, ask you the question, well, the market says your last two product launches look pretty incremental, so where's your new breakthrough? So it's not entirely foolish for them to say, well, I'm not really going to specialize in that game. It's too difficult to do. So, I don't want to give the impression I think China's going to completely take over the world, or they're the only way to do things. But it should challenge some of our perceptions. There is a role for breakthrough innovation. They're probably not going to be the leaders in that, but there's a lot of other things out there that in the commercial world. And the ability to take new ideas and breakthroughs and get them to market very quickly and efficiently, I think is an incredibly important skill in terms of international competition.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, the tablet computer has been around for 30 years, so Apple kind of perfected it.
Right.
With the seeing ahead in terms of the technology trends and
Yeah.
acquiring the right technology and so on. So.
Yes, Prof, I think it was very interesting talk you've given us. You cover a number of companies higher,
Yes.
very big home appliances business, and Xiaomi, but they're very successful in the domestic market. They've done very well. When do you see they're able to compete in the world market, global market, against international brands?
Yes. Well, there's a perception here that they're not doing it. Haier is, I believe, number 3 in the world in appliances now, and they do compete. The reason we don't think that they are penetrating the international market in brands is because they tend to start from peripheral markets and emerging markets and work back into the center. And because Singapore is a quite developed market, it's not the first on their list. So if you go to Africa, you'll find that the major dominant brands of television sets like Hisense or appliances and air conditioners like Midea are Chinese. So they actually are penetrating the international market, but not in the, we don't see them because it would be foolish of them to start with the most competitive, most sophisticated market. So I think they're already starting to change the global competitive landscape. But of course, it takes a long time to build brand equity and those kind of things where they're still weak. And in developed markets where they're incredibly important, they're still behind the curve. But because you don't see them on Times Square or Trafalgar Square in London or the center of Singapore doesn't mean that they haven't actually penetrated the global market in many countries of the world. Hello.
I'll be brief because it's dinner time. My name is Jackson. I'm Singaporean. It's important to stress because you cannot assume in SMU.
Right.
Faculty. Professor, as a Brit, I thoroughly enjoy your talk.
Thank you.
And this is actually in answer to your question. Your question says it demands a response.
Oh, good.
And
good.
with due respect, I would like to share. You begin wonderfully by saying and mentioning the 4 grades, paper, explosives. You end, and throughout, I see the charts, you track history. So I thought, wow, very humanistic. You bring in from different areas, culture. You didn't really dwell too much, but very, very focused on innovation. My response is this: there's no need for response because how you started out tells me you hit the nail on the head. This is part of human heritage, Renaissance. When they are opening up, the best part is the advice, as you mentioned in passing, to your British government. You don't have to see them as direct competitors. By all means, go there. Use what they have learned from the world, take back. It's part of the whole thing. That's what SMU is very successful because I came from that school opposite called St. Joseph's. It's really a buzz here. Whereas when I go to U-Town under this thing called Create, images of large greenery like the UCLA campuses. So many things we try. I don't blame my government trying. But it's in the natural process of interaction that innovation, creativity flows, and out of which we apply some discipline on such processes and stuff to compete. We're not so naive as a businessman, but I thoroughly enjoy your talk, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the dinner. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for reminding us that it's not a zero-sum game and that we should try to see the positive possibilities of cooperation, not just competition in this process. I think that's probably an excellent place to end. So thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for the very engaging session. May I invite you to stay on stage and invite Provost on stage to present you with a token of appreciation and for photo taking.
I have 3 or 4 words. Incredible presentation, incredible questions, and I loved the last comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much. A great honor, as I said, to come to SMU and to give the Shaw Foundation lecture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the SMU Shaw Foundation Distinguished Faculty Lecture.
Really thanks for all
we wish
the
you a good
organizers.
evening, and please do join us for dinner, which is served at the lobby of the auditorium. Thank you.